Hello and welcome to Cover, our semi-regular review of sporting books where I give you my opinion of what's on the bookshelves at the moment. And as usual, we'd love to hear from you, especially if you've got a book you'd like us to review. There's the email address to get in touch, sean.everett@supersport.com. Okay, today's book is This Is Your Everest, published by Polaris Books in the UK, written by Tom English and Peter Burns, not actually available in hard copy in South Africa. I'm hoping that one of our local publishers will pick it up. And of course, it is available online, all of the normal sources. You can get it as a download, and I'm sure you can probably persuade somebody to deliver one to you as well. Well, the title is a quote from the extraordinary Jim Telfer, the man who, along with Ian McGeechan, coached the British and Irish Lions to victory against the Springboks in 1997. Those of you who've seen the video of the tour, Living with Lions, may remember Jim Telfer giving his speech ahead of the first test, crouched around with his lions forwards. In fact, it's probably fair to say that this book is an update on that fly on the wall documentary, looking in on its making and the protagonists almost quarter of a century later. It's a project that came out of the first hard lockdown, with the authors spending hours on Skype and Zoom talking to the players and coaches of both the Lions and the Boks, as well as the men who held the cameras and edited the footage. And that's a story in itself, because Duncan Humphreys and Clive Rees, having bought the rights for £30,000, thought that they would easily sell it on to the BBC or another major broadcaster, but they all said, what's the point? They're playing against the world champions in their own backyard. The Lions will get their asses kicked. And so Clive Rees was forced to remortgage his own house to finance the trip. And when everything was finished, the bill came to £350,000. Of course, the happy ending is that Living with Lions was hugely successful and made lots of money instead of losing lots of money. Now, I mention that as an example of what makes this book such a fine read. It's full of unexpected stories told firsthand. And I imagine that after a few interviews, the authors realized that they had masses of material, much of which owed its power to the use of language by the interviewees. And so they adopted a cinematic approach, stringing together verbatim interviews and taking an authorial back seat wherever possible. The real achievement, an achievement that echoes Living with Lions, is in the editing. There are pages where as many as 4 people are talking about the same thing, and it is as if they are in the room together instead of scattered around the world in lockdown, which is the actual reality. One of the best parts of the book is the interviews with players talking about how they received the news of selection for the Lions. In those days, you got a letter in the post with a crest on front of the letter. Barry Williams, the Welsh hooker, said that the whole of Llandovery knew that he was going before he did because of the postman at the sorting office. I used to be a postman, so I get this. Instead of putting the letter through the postbox, the postman knocked on the door and handed it to Barry, said, "You're going to South Africa." Winger John Bentley was due to play rugby league for Halifax for 4 months. Touring with the Lions meant that he'd only get half as much money as he would have done had he been paid by Halifax, but you don't turn down the Lions. Manager Fran Cotton and Ian McGeechan, both undefeated Lions players on the legendary tour of South Africa in 1974, had a huge impact everywhere they went. Sports Minister Steve Schwetty talked about listening to the 1974 tests on the radio on Robben Island and how Willie John McBride's victorious Lions had given hope to the political prisoners. The tour itself is put into context with background on the musical chairs of Bok coaches and how the most bizarre decision was made to give the job to Carl du Plessis. The Prince of Wings was and is universally admired as a great player and a lovely man with a fine intellect. But in 1997, he'd never been the head coach of any team, and he lasted a single domestic season, winning just 3 out of 8, and one of those was against Tonga. Now, from a local perspective, the interviews with the men who played under Carl are fascinating, and you get the feeling that the likes of Gary Teichmann, Ostjorand, Mark Andrews are far more candid than they would have been if they'd been interviewed by the local media. Having said that, quarter of a century distance from the series also allows greater candor, since careers and friendships are no longer on the line. The great debate remains the same now as it was then. How did a ragtag bunch of English, Welsh, Scottish and Irish rugby players manage to beat the world champions in their own backyard? From the South African perspective, it's always been the same. An average Lions team was allowed to win through coaching and selecting weaknesses in the box. Indeed, Keith Wood, the Lions' talismanic Irish hooker, says that if the great kicker Neil Jenkins had played for the Boks instead of the Lions, then the home side would have won the series 3-0. But what this book argues is that this was, in fact, a fine Lions squad with depth in key positions, inspired leadership from Martin Johnson, and a coaching team that knew how to get the best out of their players. Only the Bulls managed to beat them outside the tests, while the Boks consolation win in the third test was against a much-changed team. The first two tests featured the England back row of Lawrence Dallaglio, Richard Hill and Neil Back coming off the bench, and 6 years later they would be key members of the England World Cup winning team. And one area in which the Lions were markedly superior was at centre, where the mighty Scott Gibbs of Wales at 12 partnered the gifted Jeremy Guscott of England. Now the Boks faced this pair in the first test with Idrik Lubba and Jaapie Mulder, and in the second with Dani van Schalkwyk and making his test debut Percy Montgomery. Meanwhile, they had a centre pair that could have matched Gibbs and Guscott move for move, tackle for tackle, but Henry Honourable was at fly half and Andre Snyman was on the wing, which meant that there was no room for Yanni de Beer to kick goals. And it was a series that was decided by kicks. The Boks, using 3 kickers, missed 6 out of 6 in the second test, while Guscott's unlikely drop goal in the dying minutes settled both the match and the series. The Boks scored 9 tries to 3 over the series and yet lost 2-1. Now, reading this book brings back all the pain of those times, the unnecessary end to Francois Pienaar's captaincy, the lager mentality that put Karel du Plessis in charge, the refusal to learn from mistakes, and much, much more. But it also brings to life the joy of the Lions, the way they tried to play an exciting brand of rugby outside of the test matches, their canny identification of the Boks' greatest threats and effective measures to nullify them. It's clear from reading the interviews that the players had the time of their lives, and as McGeechan said they would, quarter of a century later, seeing a fellow tourist, no words are necessary, there's just a look. As hard as it might be for local rugby supporters to admit defeat, I urge you to read this book, and I give it a top-notch 9 out of 10. Now, the publishers have very kindly given us 5 books as prizes. All I need you to do is answer this question and email us at sean.everett@supersport.com. The first 5 correct answers will receive a copy of This Is Your Everest. So here's the question. How many series have the Lions won in South Africa? How many series have the Lions won in South Africa? Think you know? Email us. Thanks for watching, and let's hope for a memorable series. That's it for today. I leave you with a quote from the book, from Neil Jenkins, the man whose nerveless goal kicking helped win the series. He said, "When I was taking my kicks, my thoughts always drifted to where I'm from in Church Village, my pitch in Kai Fadra. I was never at any of the big stadiums. I was just a kid again, practicing back at Kai Fadra. Like my dad and I have always said, pressure is for other people."